Welcome to another midday StackUp session. I'm Charlie O'Donnell, and it's a bit shadowed actually. I'm going to turn towards it. There we go. That's a little better. I'm Charlie O'Donnell from Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, and I've got two people who I've known for quite a long time, and they are two of the top people minds in the New York startup community. They'll tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds, but what we're going to do today is to produce a real solid deliverable. So we're on this journey here, going function by function across different parts of a startup. And instead of doing panels that kind of meander and storytell, and you kind of walk away with a little bit of a glimpse of something, but not really something substantive, we are putting together a real actual document and going stage by stage across startups to try and figure out what should some of these startup functions look like at different points in the company. So Natalie, I'll let you jump in and share a little bit about your background.
Sure. I also just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me, Charlie. I think what you're doing here in terms of the learning piece, and also just the thought leadership piece that people can get a hold of and see these frameworks. I love the way you're building them in terms of frameworks. So really happy to be here. I've had a very untraditional background. I've worked for 20 years, and I would say the last 15 have been in HR. The last, call it 10, have been in startups. And so I have been the people leader at 3 different startups, and really the ownership looks like, and I'd love to hear how Manya describes it as well, but like it is, HR, it's talent acquisition, it's anything that touches sort of that employee experience along that journey of from the moment they see something about your brand till the day you say, thank you so much for working here for how long, and best luck to you. And then all the way over to learning and development, professional development, and then I've even owned facilities before as well too. That's always a really fun one, is build an office while you're building everything else. It's real fun, real fun. So I would say, I guess the only thing in terms of boldstart, we are a seed investing VC. We're one of the oldest ones out there, meaning that we're 11 years old, which is hilarious that that's one of the oldest. We have a number of unicorns that have emerged during COVID, and we play in a very particular space. So we are basically B2B enterprise SaaS in a lot of cases, but also dev tooling, infrastructure. We're starting to really go hard on crypto and things like that. And apparently someone at Stanford did a study, and we have the most unicorns of any seed investing firm out there. So we're hitting now, which means I'm crazy busy. And do I ever sleep? Don't ever ask me that question. So that's that's me. And let me say one last thing, because I think also there is one distinction to be made in platform, which is there are a lot of talent partners who either have spent time in exec search, and that's really what they work on. I, because of the people leader experience, really kind of like own everything people ops. So I work with our earliest stage seed founders to build highly technical, but also people forward types of companies as quickly as possible. So it's not just like the recruiting piece, it's also getting an O visa, setting up a company in Portugal, and all of the things. So I'm like an augmented people leader for all of our seed stage companies.
Nice,
so
thanks for joining us. And Manya?
Yeah, Hi, I'm Manya Ellenberg. I lead the people team at Thyme Care. Thyme Care is a startup whose mission is to radically change the cancer journey for all. I started my career actually when I first met Charlie at a nonprofit called Hack and Why. Their mission was to connect students with startups in New York City. And after doing that for a bit, I jumped to Flatiron Health, which is a healthcare technology company. I took Flatiron from about 13 to over 500 in about 4.5 years. Oversaw all of people operations there. Since then, I've made my way through another couple New York City startups. Most recently, prior to Thyme Care, I was at Hyperscience, where I oversaw 6-fold growth in about 2.5 years and expansion into 10 plus countries, all while in the middle of a pandemic. So I get great joy from building and leading people teams at high growth New York City startups. And besides that, born and raised here in New York City, still live in Lower Manhattan now with my husband and my 2 daughters.
Nice, cool. All right, so let's get to work. Naomi is going to queue up our document here. And first of all, just for context, Natalie, you touched upon it a little, and I want to outline sort of, because we referred to this session as human resources. Sometimes it's called people.
Yep.
Let's think about this as a department. Right?
Yep.
And so, Natalie, what do you call this whole function, and what are the various pieces of it?
I feel like me and Manya are gonna just start clapping because finally people are like starting to understand how we are not the traditional buttoned up HR leaders, at least not in some of the groups that we are, I know both of us are a part of. And so I think our roles have changed extensively. We have a seat at the table first and foremost. We at least, and again, I should say this if I didn't say this before, I have been in startups before, so I have this startup vibe, but I also have seeing the ecosystem from the VC side. And so yeah, I would say, wait, go back to your question one more time, Charlie.
So should we call this, is it right to just refer to this now as the people function? And
right, I got you. Okay, so what I would say on the people side of things is if you think of your people as your biggest asset, and I would hope that most founders would, not everyone does, but most do. You've got to think about everything from building your fundamentals of HR, building blocks, to really what comes first, which is in a lot of cases, it's the recruiting piece. It's getting those right people with the right DNA, which typically is not the DNA that you're gonna see later in an organization. It can happen, but very rarely, which is why I'm starting to work with a lot of candidates who I want to market as like early stage, as opposed to, coming out of the gate saying, yeah, I'll work at Salesforce, or I'll work at, another small company. And really understanding what the fit and what the DNA is of a person who would make sense in that role. So it's
let me ask you a question about you touched upon something really interesting, and maybe we'll sort of carve this out, because I think we want to lean a little more towards, we'll touch upon recruiting, but that's going to be sort of its own whole session. But you mentioned something that I think happens, and I wonder if it should happen this way, or if it's sort of unintentional, that oftentimes the people function that happens earliest in a company is recruiting. And then later, once you have all of these people, you kind of got to figure out what to do with them and how to get them working together and make sure chaos doesn't ensue. So when you're counseling early stage companies,
Yep.
The whole idea that, like, the typical founders, like, I need this person, I need this person.
Yep.
What is the function that isn't recruiting
Mhm.
look like, sort of right off the bat? Like, is there stuff to do that maybe sometimes gets ignored, or how should people be thinking about the sort of HR culture, all of that sort of stuff, like
Yep.
right off the bat? Is there something to be done before I put that first job opening for a developer?
Yep. So I think that's a great question, and it's something that we talk about flywheels a lot at boldstart, but it is something that I have built with our founders, because about 80% of our founders are pre-product, and about 50% of them are even pre-incorporation. And so my goal is really, at the end of the day, if you distill everything, it's like, how do you close that gap between your seed round and your A round as quickly as possible? And part of that is really, who can you hire? And if you are hiring every single person from your last companies, how long does that last? That doesn't actually, it doesn't pan out for that long. And so it's a lot about, like, working with them to think through the types of people that they absolutely crucially have to have in place, that frankly, in a lot of stages or in a lot of companies have the wrong DNA, to be frank. And so it's a lot of the work that I do with our early stage founders is helping them identify the types of profiles, the types of archetypes that are the people that you want to be there in that early stage. And those people are, the executors, the people who want impact as quickly as possible. They're the people who frankly are, I would call them people who are, we think of them as people who are interested in the next shiny new toy, but it's really like people who like to build in greenfield spaces. It's hard problems.
There's a lot of planning involved in
Yep.
the sort of
Exactly.
So how far, when you meet with a team at even the pre-product stage,
Yep.
how far out? I mean, are you sitting here talking about building out a potential future org chart that, like, how far out should people be thinking?
Well, I think in the early days, like sometimes if you think out too far, what ends up happening with a lot of those founders is they overhire. And that can be a huge issue, and also big ding to culture. And so what we typically do, and the way that I work with our founders when we're talking about hiring plans, is to really look at it from the perspective of, you've got this time clock, which is your runway that could run out at whatever, at whatever period of time, and to look at that against your goals. So particularly quarterly, like, what are you trying to hit in quarter one? What are you trying to hit in quarter two? What are you trying to hit in quarter three? And then backing out from there, the type of talent that you would need in order to accomplish those goals. And in a lot of cases, in those early days, and this is one of the things that I harp on a lot, is you should be looking for what we call Swiss Army knives, as opposed to, I hate the word generalist, because to me it sounds very mediocre. And so you're looking for the people who love, experiential learning, which frankly is the best type of learning, which is just learning by doing the thing that you're being asked to do. The people who will, take on more, even if it's not in their job description. It's we call them glue people. It's the team-centric people. And that profile really does start to change as you go forward. But yeah, I would say Swiss Army knives, the people, I used to say, I want to see 1.5, I want to see 1.5 persons of mileage out of every hire that we make in those early days, with the assumption that we don't want to burn anybody out.
Of course.
So yeah.
So along those lines, in trying to prevent, that burnout and trying to form maybe some of the aspects of culture, Manya, I'll ask you to jump in. We talked a little bit about sort of planning for recruiting, but what are some of the non-recruiting things that folks can think about right out of the gate? Because like we said, people are so recruiting focused right off the bat.
Yeah, Charlie, I think a recruiter is not necessarily your first hire to the people team. I think, there's the core HR stuff like payroll, like benefits.
Right.
And depending on how many roles you plan to hire, you might not need a full-time recruiter right off of the bat.
Sure.
I see a lot of times the founder is playing that role, right? Or you get, I think, kind of Natalie mentioned this, maybe your first hire, and this was actually a role that I played very early on at Flatiron. Like, I was one of the first non-technical hires. My title was something like special projects. I was HR, legal, recruiting, finance, like all in one, and helped out with some of those people related things in addition to many other responsibilities. And I think that is a role that's might be helpful to consider in the early days where you're not yet, I do think startups are, as they've seen through this pandemic and even earlier on, like the people team is essential and crucial. But if you're not yet ready for a head of people, having someone in this role that can both do a little bit of recruiting, supporting founders, supporting hiring managers, but also thinking about payroll, benefits, how do we onboard these early hires, is what you have a role that I've hired for, and I think has been really successful very early days in a startup.
So it almost sounds a little bit.
Can I double down really quickly on what Manya said that I think is really, really important, which is the building of the fundamentals of HR while you're doing the sort of recruiting piece. She's absolutely right. The PEOs, the EORs, how do you pay your people? How do you classify your people? All of those kinds of things can actually be boilerplate. And so the way that I work with our early stage founders who are all in stealth is, how do I help you build those things, actually get in the trenches with you? And most of the things I've, as Manya has to, architected, built, had to fight for, have bought, have messaged to everybody. And so it becomes this, sorry, I keep losing my train of thought a little bit, but these are the kinds of things that we actually need to be thinking about before, from a foundational level. The hard part is being able to do those two things in tandem, especially when you're, one person, which I think is why it's also, from a tooling perspective, it is, unfortunately, it becomes a problem. I think in a lot of cases that you have to throw money at, which is just, you have to have some external recruiters, hopefully that you have a partnership.
Before we jump into recruiting, I want to actually double down on this role a little bit. Manya, you said your first title was special projects. Some people refer to that as chief of staff, or it's a role sometimes that the chief of staff picks up. It almost sounds a little bit reactive. Hey, we have a person here who isn't coding, and we just brought on all these people and they expect to get paid. So, figure out how to make that happen. My question would be for both of you, even in some of those very foundational payroll types of functions, right? There's somebody here, they need a computer, they need a desk, they need a paycheck. What are the things that early jack of all trades kind of person could be doing, and how should they be proactively spending their time to make this a little more than organized chaos?
I'm happy to take a first pass,
Sure.
Natalie. Well, first of all, Charlie, I think like in the early days, given everything going on, it's okay to be a little reactive. I will say, even in my role right now, at the start of my week, if I list my, like, here are the 3 things I want to accomplish, being in a role where you're helping to support managers and employees, stuff comes up that is like out of your control. And part of that is reacting to it. So I don't think it's like, there is going to be stuff. I remember even early days Flatiron, like we had our first pregnant employee. We didn't have a parental leave policy in place. Great. Let's now give some real thought to like what we think a generous parental leave policy is for this company. That said,
So you wouldn't say necessarily doing those policies in advance of when they come up?
if you're able to, if you're actually able to like create a little mini roadmap for yourself, do I think it is helpful to think about those things from the very early days? Yes. But
Right.
given the like chaos, the ambiguity of everything going on, like don't knock yourself if you're unable to like proactively put those things in place day one. I would
Right.
think about it though in terms of, again, like the employee life cycle. Okay, we need to hire people because we cannot achieve our goals if we don't have this team in place. Great. Now let's think about the recruiting process. Then after that, great, we've hired someone. How do we onboard them? Great.
Right.
Now let's focus on onboarding. And then like things that happen, like if you think about, again, that employee life cycle, I've onboarded, great. At some point we need, how do we think about how we evaluate performance? How do we reevaluate compensation? And so I think a lot of like, if you are going to be proactive about your little mini roadmap, I'd really just think about your employee life cycle and build towards that, if that makes sense.
Yep. Gotcha. Let me ask you about the onboarding piece specifically. Are there any best practices for companies who, hiring their first handful of employees, who, other than finding them internet and a place to plug in and a desk, as we get back to that kind of environment, what should companies be thinking about in an onboarding process?
I'm happy
Go ahead.
to jump in on that one really quickly. And then one thing I will say is like, part of what Manya was saying is very true. It is really hard in our roles to get hyper proactive, although sometimes it's better to be reactive. My goal is to get these 2 to 3 founders ready to go with a generous parental leave policy, with a potentially a compassionate leave policy, with a learning and development scenario, and more importantly, leveling and growth opportunities before they get out there, before they even launch, so that when they get out there, and this is purely as a reaction to the market that we're in right now from a talent perspective. I mean, we had like 4.7 people leave the workforce in January alone. It's absurd. So it is, how do I get these people who are, it's like 2 to 3 people, being able to evangelize kind of the benefits that we have created, so that you can come up against not the FANGs basically, but like other startups that are starting to go global.
That's a very important point that I actually just want to put a pin on there for a moment. Is that maybe in prior days, companies could get away with, or sort of build the plane as they were flying, in terms of some of these benefits, development, all of this sort of stuff. But now, as the talent market becomes more competitive, employees are wanting to know these things, right? And so you may be in a position where, maybe you would have pushed this to the side a little bit or kicked the can down the road, but you need to put out a job spec and you need to say what it is like to work at this company, and maybe you need to be more thoughtful about that earlier.
100%. And then I would actually link what your question was on the onboarding piece, and I'd love to hear Manya's thoughts on this as well, is when I say onboarding, I don't mean I've looked at your license and it matches up with your I-9, we're good to go, here's your computer. The way that I think about onboarding is an opportunity to facilitate, because I do not onboard, at least in my history in startups, onboard teams together. I onboard everybody together. So you've got your very senior and you've got your very junior people together for typically about 2 days. And so they're building those cross-cultural and cross-team relationships, which are going to be the things that are going to be moving you to the next level, because they always say, once you have really good friends at work and you start to depend on each other, that's when the best products are done. So I use it for institutional knowledge, for getting people evangelized around, like I bring in the founders, I have them evangelize the mission, vision, roadmap, etc. Then I bring in leaders, and so basically using it as an opportunity to actually give them all of the knowledge that they need to know, even though it's overwhelming, all of the knowledge that they need to know, and all of the point people they need to know as well, joining our company.
Gotcha. So, so when you think about those first kind of handful of folks, and starting to build this out, just from a functional perspective, all of these pieces, whether it's like roadmap, policy, are there any tools that you guys would recommend for, if I'm, we're still in the early stages, right? Like I'm 2 founders, maybe I've got a chief of staff who is, taking on some of this sort of people and HR responsibility, and I'm starting to bring my first folks in from where do I find our company stuff? Can I get away with a Google Doc, or is there any kind of off the shelf sort of, place to find all of the HR things, checklists, all of that sort of stuff that you would recommend that people start using right off the bat, maybe as a part of my PEO?
Yeah, I would say a couple of PEOs that I wanted to put down here that I think people should be aware of. JustWorks, Sequoia. But I would say, Charlie, I think in the very, for payroll and benefits, but I think for very early days, again, unless your early days, but hiring 10 people a month, you could do without an applicant tracking system right now. You can get away with a lot of, Google Docs, Google Forms, Google spreadsheets. But you can't run payroll through Google Docs. You need to have a tool for that. So I would say the first one you should be thinking about is, how do I pay people? How do they sign up for benefits? I'm sure there are other PEOs, namely Gusto. I most recently have experience with JustWorks and Sequoia, though, so I could speak more to those. And I would say, unless you are doing a lot of hiring per month, you can get away with collecting feedback over email or in a Google form. I don't think you need to spend the money on an applicant tracking system very early on.
Gotcha. So maybe we'll move applicant tracking a couple columns over, and stick to forms for the moment. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a team. I've got my, 2 founders, my chief of staff, and my sort of 3 developers or whatever, and we're building out something. is there, where do people go? You know, for example, you guys mentioned having to hit the parental leave policy or whatever. Once you start having people work together, things come up, right? And where would somebody go to find policies, right? To, like, as a best practice, if I'm like, oh, okay, you know, we've been working together for 6 months and somebody asked me if they could take, you know, some time off, and like, oh shoot, we never came up with a vacation policy or whatever. Like, where do I go for early stage sort of best practice information if I don't necessarily have a full-time, you know, HR or people person? I mean, Natalie, I'm sure you've probably got this built out.
I know. I'm like,
Companies, but-
I'm like me, just come to me and I'll teach you how to do it. No, but I just have templates and things like that that I've created over the years. I have a HR checklist that's from SHRM that's more about like business insurance that you should have. Like
That's HRM, right? That's like the
that's
professional org.
I'm sorry. Yeah, SHRM is the society. It's basically the Society of Professional HR People, and so there is a checklist on there. But I created a bespoke onboarding and offboarding checklist as well, that has every technology that every single person has access to, that you know, that we, like on the executive team, have access to in the event that you know, you have to terminate someone and you want it to be one click and everything's kind of like over with. But what I would say
That's a hack that we didn't actually bring up before, that you're also part-time InfoSec person, because you know, you have to keep track of who has access to stuff if you're onboarding them.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
would
So
say-
all of
You have a Manya, did you have something you wanted to add
No,
there?
I was just gonna say, if you are looking for, if you are a founder without someone on the team with HR expertise, there are a few places that I'd recommend going to. I think one, like there are now like a Natalie or Natalie type, if you have invested money, I think now VCs are doing, if their people leaders are doing wonderful jobs of creating you know, groups of from their portfolio companies and relying on other, you know, I don't have an HR leader yet, but you know, other portfolio companies do have HR leaders. Reach out to them, ask to be introduced. I think there are also a lot of companies who now are open sourcing their employee handbooks. GitLab is one that like immediately comes to mind, that's been so helpful to me, especially in now like a fully distributed work environment in the pandemic. How are they doing things? And so seeing what you can find in terms of open sourced employee handbooks and using that as a tool in your toolbox. Yeah, I would say that. And also, if you join one of these PEOs like a JustWorks or a Sequoia, one of the benefits of those is that they have in-house HR expertise and you're paying for it. And so you could reach out to them and be like, hey, I don't have X, Y, and Z policy. Do you have a template? What have you seen? So those are some places that I recommend turning to before you make your kind of first HR hire as a resource as you're building some of this stuff out.
Gotcha.
fully agree. And usually people are not making, you know, people ops hire in their first 5 hires. And so you really, I push for everyone to get into a PEO or a PEO EOR that can help them, well, first of all, help them pay their people, but they provide so many resources, and just in terms of like boilerplate things that you can make bespoke, that, you know, people will come to me and I'll be like, here, I have 3 handbooks, but honestly, like I would go to one of the companies that's probably updating on a regular basis, just because our law is changing regularly, particularly around the pandemic and things like that.
So Jess Rosen in our chat, who's an employment lawyer who works with growing companies, made a great comment about culture and building culture early. And it's something that I 100% agree on. And, you know, for some founders, I think they haven't necessarily worked in a place where they have been a part of building of a culture, where culture is something that, you know, if previously they were employee number 75 at their last company, and then they go start something, like, they don't totally know how the culture happened, and sometimes it's a good culture and sometimes not. But I'd be curious as to what, in what ways can, you know, early founders, especially like when you're past that like core group of the first 5 people or something like that, where, you know, where not everybody's sort of sitting at the same table kind of thing. I'm a founder who wants to build a good culture. What do I mean? What do I even mean by that? Or what are you as people professionals assessing when you see that? And what are the kinds of things that people could be doing earlier on?
You want to take that, Manya, or do you want me to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. It is not an easy one. I think, Charlie, something about culture and starting a company, like, I think, right, if you want to be intentional about it, you really need to give some thought to, like, what does that mean? What is the type of culture? How do we want to behave towards each other? You know, both internally to our team, externally to our customers, to our advisors, to our investors. And I think, to your point, like, I think in the early days, like, you kind of just feel it and know it. And then you get to a certain point where you might start to see those cracks if you don't actually like articulate them and write them down. And so I would, you know, the other thing I think is, like, with every hire you bring on, they add to your culture.
Right.
And so it's something that is changing. I think, though, that's where, like, the values piece come in. Like, what are your operating principles? What are your values? Are you able to articulate them and then use them in terms of determining whether or not this hire is going to be a value add or a culture add to your team? And they should be things that not everyone agree with. They should be things that are unique to your company, because it's a way to actually, like, know, hey, I actually don't agree with these values. It's not a place for me. So, like, I'm going to go either, you know, work somewhere else, or I'm not going to accept this offer, or what have you. You should have values that actually make people pause and think of, like, is this a place that I'm actually signing up for? And I'm going to be on board with behaving and acting this way. And so I think that if you're able to, from a very early on, kind of and they don't have to be like 10, like, right? We could talk about, like, this is my 1 operating principle. These are my 3 operating principles or values. Articulate them, and then use those in terms of assessing people against those as you interview them. Use that as a way to evaluate people as they work at your company, and make sure that, like, there are some checks in place to really know how, if you're living up to your value or to your operating principle at a company.
One of the things I just dropped in the chat is a company that I think got acquired last year, the year before, X.AI, that had a pledge, an employee pledge, that in addition to signing your options agreement and all the official stuff, it was basically an articulation of the relationship between you and other employees in the company. And it was stuff like, you know, I intend to communicate as much as possible. I won't pass up an opportunity to help out a colleague. like those types of things. And Dennis Mortensen, the founder, told me that he had negotiated hard with an employee who finally decided to join. They made an offer, they read the pledge, and then they, to your point, paused and was like, you know what, I don't think I'm the right fit for this. And, you know, it was somebody, I think they stumbled upon the, like, I'm comfortable operating in the dark. And I think their prior company was, you know, just a place where it was just too startup-y and not, you know, expectations weren't clear all the time. And they'd kind of had enough of that. And when they read that, it was difficult for them to actually sign. So it was, you know, them weeding themselves out of what would otherwise be, you know, the sort of stated culture. But I also want to comment on one other thing that you said about adding to culture. A lot of times people get assessed as to whether or not they fit a company culture and whether somebody's a culture fit. But when you have 5 people and you're adding on a 6th and a 7th, you're actually really, that person is adding to the culture. And I think you want to be intentional about it. Say, what does this person bring? What kind of culture direction does this person take us? And is that where we want to go? Right? Because maybe that's really where we want to go. Actually, this person brings something that, you know, is different, but better, you know? So I think that's important to consider as well.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, we probably could spend a whole other hour on just like diversity, equity, and inclusion at startups, but like, you know, I won't have to get into the research around like how more diverse teams actually like, right, do better. And I think that's right, an important part, especially at the like adding to the culture part. What does this person bring that's unique and different across a whole slew of backgrounds and experiences, and that will actually push us forward and move us ahead, is also something I think really important to think about at the very early days. One other thing I just want to say about values is don't bother like writing them down if you're not going to do the work to actually incorporate them into your culture and into your company. Like, it is meaningless if you just like put them up on your website and then that's it, and you don't use them as a tool for your culture and for your team. And so I would really kind of urge you to if you're going to go through that process, to also then put in the work to use them and incorporate them into all of your people processes. And I also will say though, and I actually experienced this at one of my startups where I joined, they didn't have operating principles or values, and was working with a founder who like was upset by some of the behavior that they were seeing at the company, but felt like they couldn't say anything about it because they didn't have those values. And I just want to say, like, just because you don't have the operating principles or values also doesn't mean that's an excuse to like not speak up and not do something about behavior that you're not happy about. It takes a lot of work, I think, to like come up with these and to finalize the values, but that's no excuse for like not dealing with something as you see it. I think like early and often giving feedback, addressing things also says a lot about your culture and how you manage and handle people.
On the feedback side, and Natalie, I'll direct this towards you. Feedback, taking the temperature of sort of what's going on in the organization. Okay, so now we've got, you know, we're up to like 8, 9, maybe we're growing, you know, into the teens kind of thing. Now we've got something that's starting to feel not like a big company, but a small company. And it's getting to the point where, as a founder, I'm not always sure what's going on with everybody. You know, 15 people is a lot of people for me to sort of mentally and emotionally keep track of. And you mentioned, you know, you want to make sure you don't burn people out. Are there tools or processes or best practices around just kind of keeping tabs on how everybody's doing? You know, I've seen like little Slack things and nudges and pokes and all that sort of stuff. But how do you recommend to that kind of maybe pre-Series A, but, has a dozen people or so on a team to just check in with everybody?
Yeah, so I think real-time feedback is I can't tell you how many people have come to me and been like when I was an operator and said I'm going to fire this person. I'm like, interesting. I've never heard one negative thing about this person before. And I'm going to need you to actually go back. Like, did you give this person feedback? No, I did not. So this is going to be a surprise when we pull them into the room and I tell them what's going on. This is going to be a surprise. Okay. That's not the way we do things here. And so I'll send them back and just basically say, look, like, I want you to work directly with this person to try and up-level them. If you can't up-level them in a particular amount of time, which you have shared with that employee, then you need to also make it clear that that could mean, that we're just not aligned. I would say that
it sounds like in that situation, that's when you actually have somebody on the people side. But before you actually have somebody full time, and maybe what you're alluding to is maybe starting to think about a resource.
Yeah.
Like how do I actually do that check-in? I mean, I've first time CEO here.
Yeah.
Is it just a matter of taking meetings with everybody? Are there tools?
Yeah, so there's actually a number of tools that are great for this, but one thing that I've found important, and this kind of like harkens back to the question you were asking before, is like First Round did an article years ago that was about 80% of your culture coming directly from the top. And I think we have enough tech examples like the Ubers of the world, like the Betters of the world, et cetera, that no matter how many people they have kind of corralling them, protecting them, that the toxicity or whatever it may be, the positivity, all of it, it comes down. But I think that the thing that I have noticed with the pace of digital transformation, which I think is partly because of this COVID scenario, is that we have to get a little bit quicker, earlier, and also start thinking about building things before you're even like, out there actually recruiting. And so feedback actually becomes one of those things that you're working with your people on. And so that could even become, one of your values, or even one of your like an aspirational type of value, that we are a company that, that gives feedback freely, or, we believe in radical candor, or whatever it may be. But that feeds that in, and actually, like, if they don't have the people leader, that the leaders of the company are drumming that in, like they are drumming the mission, vision, and roadmap as early as possible. And then you have your people starting to understand how to connect the dots between what they're doing and what's actually happening in the business.
And is there a mechanism that you recommend? Is it something so simple as just, a weekly sit down with team members, or is there something that is more scalable at sort of this,
Yeah, I mean, look,
dozen kind of people?
There's definitely tools like the culture amps of the world and other sort of like engagement type of surveying tools. But I'll tell you, the last time that I joined a earlier stage company, one thing that I did, because what I have seen in certain other startups as errors, I believe they're errors, are people who come from different worlds coming in, seeing a structure of a sales team or whatever, and immediately that's done, and we're putting in this other playbook and laying that down on, what we have, which in a lot of cases, and the cases that I witnessed, I was not involved with hiring any of those people. It was just a absolute, like, all of them ended up getting terminated, and they were coming from like very, 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 very well-known companies. But one thing that you can do, especially if you don't have a people leader, or if you do, and for me, this has always been one of the very first steps I take when I join as an operator, is doing a listening tour. Because at the end of the day, we have so many things to do when we are building companies. A listening tour, meaning spending time with everybody, let's call it, your 20 employees, and maybe that's over a month and a half span or whatever it needs to be, but hearing it from the horse's mouth as far as what's working, what's not working, what's concerning you, what I should be working on. And what you get out of that listening tour is the holes that you're missing. It's the things that are potential fires that you need to be working on, and you get a prioritization list. And so that actually, I think, can be one of the best tools, because on top of that, you're building trust with your employees. You're building an environment where
driven. That's not something that I can hand off to the special projects person.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you can, depending on who that person is, but as long, it needs to be a conversation. It needs to be like one of the conversations you will hear in really early stage companies from the very beginning is, how do I grow here? How do I get promoted? Like those things. And so you have to be ready with, okay, so all of a sudden, leveling and compensation banding has now become number one. That's actually that wouldn't have been my first guess, but that is number one, because 40% or 60% of the population that we interviewed is saying that that's the part where they want to know, how do they move up? And a lot of this is the changes of over the last 2 years. That's the other thing I want to stress, is like this if we would have had this conversation 2.5 years ago, we may be talking about this in different terms.
Gotcha. So Manya, when you said 13 at Flatiron.
Yes.
Was there, did Nat and Zach have a rotation going with each employee? Like what was the sort of, how do I stay in touch with the team function? And were there things that needed to be improved about that? And what did you build towards?
Yeah, so we definitely had a culture of regular one-on-ones, Charlie, at Flatiron. I'm sure there are some ex-Flatiron folks who would say it was too heavy on one-on-ones in terms of meeting types, but absolutely had weekly one-on-ones with their direct reports. One thing that I also think Nat and Zach did a great job of was skip level one-on-ones. So as your direct reports start building their teams, doing one-on-ones with them, let's say quarterly or every 8 weeks or so, Charlie, as another way of getting a sense of like how's everything going? How are their direct reports doing as managers, right? And collecting different feedback and a sense there. You get to a certain point where I think it does make sense to do something more formal. So, and again, I think like, what's the goal here? Is it an engagement survey to get a pulse of like how engaged your employees are? Or is it time where, we feel like, I actually feel like I need a better sense of performance of the team and doing a more like formal performance management process. So I do think that as a founder, especially early on, it should be doable and manageable for you to have one-on-ones with most of your team. It doesn't have to be weekly, but at some cadence that feels right, and you can always adjust. And I think that's a really good sense of getting, again, a pulse of how things are going. I will say too, in terms of the performance piece, I think if you're really thoughtful about your job description, Charlie, like from very early on, and are able to kind of articulate what are the outcomes that I'm looking for in this role, you could use that as a tool to then evaluate how your hire is doing. So you don't need some fancy performance review process. I think that, again, if you set expectations from what is the hire that I'm looking for, communicating those expectations early on as part of the onboarding process, and then using that as a tool to then evaluate performance and having those conversations is a really helpful way to, have a high performing team, to set the expectations and then to use that as a way to evaluate people against those expectations.
So you guys are single-handedly just crushing the whole HR software industry here, because I really expected to hear of all of these fancy tools and Slack plugins and all that sort of stuff to help manage my team. Is there a stage at which the simple one-on-ones and just keeping stuff in Google and whatever starts to fall apart and needs some more formality that maybe technology can be helpful with?
Yes, and I'm curious what Natalie suggests to her portfolio companies. But as I mentioned earlier on the recruiting side, I mean, listen, I think it depends on how many roles you're trying to hire for a month, but like, I think roughly in my head, and I don't know if my Sarah Ruth from my team is still on, but somewhere where you're starting to hire, 7+ roles a month, you're going to want an applicant tracking system.
Yep.
I think once you hit somewhere between 50 as you approach 100 employees, are you going to want a tool for performance management? Yes, 100%. I think the focus of this, Charlie, has been like more early stage, where I just, like, to be honest, you can get really far with just Google Docs and Google Forms and Slack and email. But again, as you I have in my head, like in the 50 to 100 range is when it's helpful to kind of introduce more of these tools. They're not cheap, to be honest. It is an investment. I think a lot of these right now, roughly, especially on the HR side, you're looking at $6 per employee per month, which maybe when you're super early stage, you're like, okay, this is fine for right now. But then think about it too.
People at 100 people, that really starts to add up.
That all of a sudden, and it's really hard then to pull a tool back once you, introduce it. So, but again, I've come from a lot of really scrappy startups, and I've made it work. And I'm sure others, depending on how you approach cash and cash burn, you might be more willing to spend the bucks on some of these things earlier on, if it makes sense for you.
I wonder if that aligns at all with not necessarily spending on some of those tools until the point where you maybe actually have a full-time person who can sort of manage and assess which ones are working and take the lead on that sort of stuff. And that's where I would sort of ask, we talked about this Swiss Army knife, jack of all trades, the chief of staff, special projects person who, is doing some of those early basic HR functions. But when I really want to level up in terms of somebody who was actually building out a real HR function in my organization, what size, is there a size? Maybe Natalie, if you want to take this, at what point do you recommend to people hey, it's maybe time for a real head of people?
Yeah, so a couple of quick things, and this is sort of going back to what I mentioned in the beginning, which was just the digital transformation and this pandemic has done nothing but speed up where, the directions that we're going, the builds, all of those things. This has sped up everything. And so while I totally agree with Manya that you can get away with pieces of paper, I will say the quicker that you can get an ATS in, the quicker that you can benchmark your performance and be able to like move money around. The only reason I bring that up is because this exact market is so unbelievably aggressive. But sorry, Charlie, go back to what you were saying. And then I would just say, a Slack tool, because I think communication as you start to scale, and especially if you're scaling quickly, is the very first thing that breaks down. And so it is like, how do we allow people to communicate through the tooling like a Slack, or through events, through onboarding, through all of these different things where we're creating, again, alignment across the org. But I missed your last question. Just ask me it one more time.
Just the stage at which companies should start to look
Right.
at a full-time people person.
Right. So I'll be very honest here. I was at Stash as a leader from, and I think I was employee somewhere between 20 and 27. And we went to about 300 in 2 years. And one of the things that I frankly think they did, I'm not sure that it was intentional, but I convinced them that I thought it was smart was to bring this person in as early as you possibly can. And I don't mean like, I actually do have some founders who have them in their founding team, who actually have them in those first five hires or whatever it may be. And what I would say is the only reason I would say that bringing them in early is because this is no longer our market for talent is so unique. We haven't seen this since World War II. So the faster that you can get people thinking about those kinds of things, the better. So it's funny because when I was looking at your document, I was starting to see what was happening for me was things that I would have called growth stage are starting to get moved over to the left, which means getting people thinking about these things as early as possible. So the reason that I say the earlier the better is because when I work with my founders, I want them going out, like I want them going like to market for their hires, understanding what their parental leave policies look like, understanding, what their learning and development stipends look like, and being able to, that's how you get, so you can go up against everyone. So I tried to get it in as early as possible. I probably would not wait beyond, I'd call it 40 people myself, just because it's too, recruiting should be part of a founder's job, a large part of a founder's job, but it cannot it cannot impede your speed to build. So if you have someone who is a point person for your biggest asset, one would assume that you would want that there fairly early.
For sure. Natalie, you touched upon something that maybe we can just sort of drop in. Maybe it's somewhere, sort of between the second and third column, salary bands. Just to switch topics for a moment. A lot of times as recruiting starts to happen, founders take these cases on an individual basis, but how early should people start to think about comp as a plan versus something that is just done individually per employee?
Oh my God. Yeah, that question.
Because people can mess that up.
No, you didn't mess it up. It's just, in the beginning, in the early days, it's the wild, wild west, right? Like everybody is just kind of doing all of the things that they can do. That's why we talk about Swiss Army knives, because they are the people who are good at a lot of different things. What I would say about the salary band piece is just, the earlier you can get it better, you can get it in place. And that doesn't even have to mean it's perfection. And I think this is one interesting point that I've expressed to a lot of my like mentees and things like that, is one of the best ways to position anything that you're rolling out to a team, particularly that's technical, is to message it in a way like you're building software. So this is V1 of comp bands. We're going to take feedback, even if it's not, whatever it may be. This is V1 of leveling. Okay, we're going to take your feedback and then we're going to do V2. And it's like that, all of a sudden people understand that this isn't just a thing that just is in place when you arrive. That's a thing that kind of like happens over time. What I will say in terms of the comp plan piece is, it can be very, very, very expensive to correct. And
Sure.
so the quicker that you can get, even if they are just, bands that you can play around with, but that are fairly
guidelines.
Loose guidelines, the better, because I've seen companies where it has costed them exponential amounts of money, even just to get pay discrepancy between men and women and trans people, etc. So I am trying to get all of my founders even thinking about these basic bands as quickly as possible, so we can make really quick decisions on candidates.
Awesome. Manya, I'm going to give you the final question here. Obviously, this is a really comprehensive area, and we're never going to get to all of it. But I wanted to ask you about if you had any recommendations on how, if I don't necessarily have a bigger VC fund with a people person sort of at the ready, what would you recommend to early stage founders in terms of advisors or contractors, consultants? Is there anything that you would say, hey, like, try and touch base with an expert as early as possible to get something even done on a project basis that maybe I can sort of use for year one? Where might that be a good spend of money?
What should they spend money on, or how to find someone to maybe consult advise with?
No, not how to find somebody, but if there was anything where you were like, hey, don't do this part on your own, go find somebody who's done this before, even just to pick their brain to say, hey, come spend an afternoon with us, whether it's I don't know, building out a handbook or policies or and any of that, or a recruiting plan.
Yeah. I would say,
or maybe every company should figure out on their own because they're individual.
No, I would say this, like, a couple of things come to mind. One, I would say, like, if there are places and companies and cultures that you have respect and admired from afar, like, put on your recruiter hat and like reach out to those HR leaders or those recruiters from those places as a starting point. I also would say, it's sad. There's been a lot of burnout in the HR leadership community, and there are a ton of people who are no longer willing right now to be in-house and who are taking on consulting and advising opportunities instead. And, between yourself, Charlie, and just like looking at other New York City startups on LinkedIn and who's posting that they're taking a break or starting something, and reaching out to those folks, because there really is a growing and large community of ex in-house people leaders that are open and willing to take on some consulting gigs right now. In terms of what to ask for, it's a little tough because I think it's really dependent on like what feels like a priority to that company. I do think recruiting is a great place to start thinking about structured competency-based interviewing, because even starting there, I think, and having that conversation about how do you hire well leads to a lot of interesting thoughts and ideas to other parts of the employee life cycle. And even just touching base with someone and picking their brains on like other lessons learned from scaling an HR team in the early days is just worth that hour or two of hearing someone's like war stories. So that's my recommendation.
Awesome. And I can't go without a portfolio company plug, of course. A lot of those former HR leaders who are now sort of consulting or doing part-time are undoubtedly on the Bravely platform. So Bravely is a resource that companies can use to provide sort of an unbiased third party when employees don't necessarily want to go to HR or feel like maybe it's not necessary. And so a lot of those leaders are available to companies. So you can check them out at Work Bravely. Thank you so much to the two of you for taking time out in the middle of the day to talk about these really important topics. I appreciate you both. And yeah, we will get this up soon. So thanks so much, guys.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
Charlie.
you.
Thanks, Natalie. Nice being on with you.
Yeah, same. Thank you both.
Bye.
Take care.